In the marble halls of Valdoria Palace, where secrets whisper through ancient corridors and power hangs heavy in the air like morning mist, Queen Isabel stood before the mirror that had reflected 5 generations of royalty. Her trembling hands clutched a letter that would shatter everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed for. The words on the parchment blurred through her tears, but their meaning was crystal clear. Her husband, King Alexander, had made a decision that would destroy not just their marriage, but the very foundation of their kingdom. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a web of betrayal that reached into the highest levels of their court, and the choice she was about to make would change the fate of millions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand dining hall of Valdoria Palace as Queen Isabel sat alone at the massive oak table that could seat 50 guests. Her breakfast remained untouched, growing cold on the finest china the kingdom had to offer. The servants moved quietly around her, their eyes downcast, sensing the tension that had settled over the palace like a heavy blanket in the past weeks. Isabel's fingers drummed nervously against the table's polished surface. She had been Queen of Valdoria for 15 years, married to King Alexander for 22, and never in all that time had she felt so utterly alone. The letter from her husband lay folded beside her teacup, its edges worn from her constant handling. She had read it dozens of times since it arrived 3 days ago, each reading making the reality more painful than the last. The heavy doors to the dining hall creaked open, and Lady Margaret, her closest confidant and lady-in-waiting, entered with measured steps. Margaret had served the royal family for over 30 years, having started as a young woman under Alexander's mother, the late Queen Victoria. Her gray hair was pulled back in its usual severe bun, but her kind eyes showed the concern she felt for her queen. "Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, approaching the table with a fresh pot of tea. "The morning papers have arrived. Perhaps it would be better if—" "Show me," Isabel interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that somehow, some way, the news would have leaked to the press. Royal scandals had a way of finding their way into the headlines, no matter how carefully guarded the palace walls were. Margaret hesitated, then placed the stack of newspapers before the queen. The headline screamed across the front pages in bold, unforgiving letters: "Royal marriage in crisis, King Alexander's shocking decision, and worst of all, Queen to be replaced." Isabel's hands shook as she picked up the first paper. The article was filled with speculation and half-truths, but the core of the story was accurate enough to make her stomach turn. Someone close to the royal family had been talking to the press, feeding them information about the private meetings between the king and his advisors, about the late-night discussions in the council chambers, about the decision that had been made regarding her future. How did they find out? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. The palace was filled with ears, and loyalty could be bought for the right price. "Lord Pemberton has been seen dining with several journalists in recent days," Margaret said carefully. "And there have been whispers among the staff about increased activity in the king's private offices." Lord Pemberton. The name sent a chill through Isabel's bones. Alexander's chief advisor had never liked her, had never approved of their marriage from the beginning. He had always believed that the king should have married someone from a more established royal bloodline, someone who could bring political alliances and military strength to Valdoria. Instead, Alexander had chosen her, the daughter of a minor duke whose only claim to nobility was a small estate in the countryside, and a family tree that, while respectable, was hardly impressive by royal standards. For years, Pemberton had been patient, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, with Valdoria facing economic difficulties and pressure from neighboring kingdoms, he had apparently found his opportunity. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside caught Isabel's attention. She recognized the measured gait immediately. Alexander was approaching. After 22 years of marriage, she knew the sound of his walk as well as her own heartbeat. But these days, instead of bringing comfort, the sound filled her with dread. King Alexander entered the dining hall with the bearing that had made him beloved by his people for over 2 decades. At 55, he was still a handsome man, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, his blue eyes still sharp and intelligent. He wore his authority like a comfortable cloak, and, even in casual morning clothes, he commanded respect and attention. But Isabel could see the strain in his face, the lines of stress that had deepened in recent months. The burden of ruling Valdoria had never been heavier, with economic pressures mounting and political tensions with neighboring Astoria reaching dangerous levels. The kingdom needed stability, needed strength, needed to project power and unity to the world. And, according to his advisors, Isabel was standing in the way of that. "Good morning," Alexander said, his voice formal and distant. He took his place at the head of the table, accepting a cup of coffee from one of the servants without looking at his wife. "Is it?" Isabel replied, gesturing to the newspapers spread before her. "Because it seems like a rather terrible morning to me." Alexander glanced at the headlines and winced. "The press always exaggerates. You know that, do they?" Isabel stood, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "Because what they're reporting seems remarkably similar to what you told me in your letter. The only difference is that now the entire kingdom knows about it." The servants in the room exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lady Margaret made a subtle gesture, and they began to file out, understanding that this was not a conversation for their ears. Soon, only Margaret remained, standing quietly by the window, close enough to assist if needed but far enough away to provide the illusion of privacy. "Isabel, please sit down," Alexander said, his voice taking on the tone he used in official meetings. "Let's discuss this rationally." "Rationally?" Isabel's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "You want me to rationally discuss the fact that my husband, the man I've loved for over 20 years, has decided to annul our marriage? That you want to cast me aside like a piece of furniture that no longer fits the decor?" "It's not like that, and you know it," Alexander said, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "The situation has changed. The kingdom's needs have changed. We have to think about what's best for Valdoria. And apparently, what's best for Valdoria is getting rid of me." Isabel's voice broke on the last words, and she hated herself for showing such weakness. Queens didn't cry in front of their subjects, even if those subjects were their husbands. Alexander finally looked at her, and, for a moment, she saw a flash of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. The young prince who had courted her with poetry and promises, who had sworn that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle their positions might create. "The council believes that a new marriage alliance could secure our borders and strengthen our economy," he said quietly. "Princess Catherine of Astoria is young, beautiful, and her dowry would solve our immediate financial problems. More importantly, marriage to her would prevent the war that seems increasingly inevitable. So this is about money and politics," Isabel said bitterly. "Our marriage, our life together, our love, none of that matters compared to a dowry and a treaty." "You're being unfair," Alexander said, standing and beginning to pace the length of the table. "You know the responsibilities I carry. The weight of an entire kingdom rests on my shoulders. Every decision I make affects millions of people. I can't afford to be selfish." "Selfish?" The word hit Isabel like a physical blow. "Is that what I am? Selfish for expecting my husband to honor the vows we made? Selfish for believing that the promises we made to each other meant something? You know that's not what I meant." "Then, what did you mean, Alexander?" "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you've decided that 15 years of marriage can be erased with a piece of paper and a signature." Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face her. "The church has agreed to grant the annulment on the grounds that our marriage was never properly consummated in the eyes of God because we haven't produced an heir." The words hung in the air between them like a curse. It was the one topic they had never spoken about openly, the one failure that had haunted their marriage from the beginning. Despite years of trying, despite consulting the best physicians in the kingdom and beyond, Isabel had never been able to give Alexander the child he needed, the heir that would secure the succession and the future of the royal line. "So it's my fault," she whispered. "Because my body failed to do what was expected of it, I'm no longer worthy to be queen." "That's not." "Yes, it is." Isabel's voice grew stronger, fueled by anger and hurt. "That's exactly what this is about. I've served this kingdom faithfully for 15 years. I've supported every decision you've made, stood by your side through every crisis, devoted my life to being the queen this nation deserved. But, because I couldn't give you a son, because my body wouldn't cooperate with the grand plan, I'm expendable." Alexander's face flushed with emotion. "Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I want this? Every night I lie awake thinking about what we're losing, what I'm giving up. But I have to think about the greater good. I have to think about the future of Valdoria." "The future of Valdoria," Isabel repeated mockingly. "How convenient that the future of Valdoria requires you to marry a 20-year-old princess while discarding the wife who has loved and supported you for over 2 decades. Catherine is intelligent, and well-educated. She speaks 5 languages and has been trained in diplomacy from childhood. She would be an asset to the kingdom, and young enough to give you the heir I couldn't. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander's inability to deny her words was confirmation enough. When Isabel asked finally, her voice hollow with defeat, "The annulment proceedings will begin next week. The wedding is planned for the spring, assuming Parliament approves the new alliance treaty." "How thoughtful of you to plan so far ahead," Isabel said bitterly. "And what of me? What becomes of the inconvenient former queen? You would retain your title as Duchess of Pembroke. You would have a comfortable estate and a generous allowance. You could live quietly, perhaps travel, pursue interests that you've never had time for as queen. In other words, disappear gracefully and cause no trouble for your new marriage." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to be fair, Isabel. I'm trying to provide for your future." "Fair?" Isabel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "There's nothing fair about any of this, Alexander." But then, again, fairness was never really a consideration in royal marriages, was it? Before he could respond, the dining hall doors burst open, and Lord Pemberton strode in without waiting for permission. The tall, thin man with his sharp features and calculating eyes had always reminded Isabel of a vulture circling carrion. His presence in the room made her skin crawl. "Your Majesty," Pemberton said, bowing briefly to Alexander while completely ignoring Isabel. "I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The Asturian ambassador is demanding an audience, and there are reports of troop movements along our eastern border." Alexander's face paled. The tensions with Asturia had been escalating for months, disputes over trade routes and territorial boundaries creating an increasingly volatile situation. War had been a looming possibility, but if troops were actually moving, it meant the situation had reached a crisis point. "How many troops?" Alexander asked. "Our scouts report at least 10,000, with more arriving hourly. They appear to be taking defensive positions, but the positioning could easily be converted to offensive capability within hours." Isabel watched the exchange with growing dread. She understood politics well enough to know what this meant. If Asturia was positioning for war, then the proposed marriage alliance wasn't just about money and heirs, it was about survival. The kingdom genuinely needed the protection that marriage to Princess Catherine would provide. "We need to move quickly," Pemberton continued. "If we can announce the engagement to Princess Catherine before Asturia commits to military action, it might be enough to de-escalate the situation. But delay could prove catastrophic." Alexander looked torn between his duty as a king and his feelings as a husband. Isabel could see the war raging behind his eyes, the battle between his heart and his crown. "How quickly could the annulment be finalized?" he asked quietly. "The church authorities are standing by. With the proper documents and testimony, it could be completed within the week. The marriage contract with Asturia could be signed immediately afterward." Isabel felt something break inside her chest. The speed with which her marriage could be dissolved, the efficiency with which she could be erased from Alexander's life and replaced with someone younger and more politically useful, was breathtaking in its cruelty. "I see," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Well, then, it seems the decision has been made for all of us." She walked to the table and picked up the letter that had started this nightmare, the formal notification of the annulment proceedings that Alexander had been too cowardly to deliver in person. With deliberate movements, she tore it into small pieces and let them flutter to the floor like snow. "If you'll excuse me," she said with all the dignity she could muster, "I have preparations to make." She walked toward the door, her back straight and her head held high. Lady Margaret fell into step beside her, providing silent support. At the threshold, Isabel paused and turned back to her husband. 22 years, Alexander," she said quietly. 22 years of my life I gave to you and to this kingdom. I hope your new princess is worth it." As she left the dining hall, Isabel could hear Pemberton already discussing logistics with the king, their voices excited and urgent as they planned the political maneuvering that would secure Valdoria's future. Her future, apparently, was no longer a consideration. But, as she walked through the corridors of the palace that had been her home for 15 years, Isabel felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Alongside the pain and betrayal, there was anger, cold, fierce, and growing stronger with each step she took. They thought they could simply cast her aside, erase her from the story as if she had never existed. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. The game was far from over, and Isabel intended to make sure that everyone involved understood the true cost of betraying a queen. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the dining hall, and Valdoria Palace buzzed with activity like a disturbed beehive. Servants scurried through the corridors carrying documents, flowers for the upcoming announcement ceremony, and whispered gossips that traveled faster than official proclamations. The news of Queen Isabel's impending annulment had spread throughout the kingdom despite the royal family's attempts at discretion, and public opinion was sharply divided. In her private chambers, Isabel sat at her writing desk, penning letters with a fury that made her normally elegant handwriting sharp and decisive. Lady Margaret watched from across the room, concern etched deeply in her weathered features. The Queen had barely slept or eaten since the announcement, instead throwing herself into correspondence with a determination that bordered on obsession. "Your Majesty," Margaret said gently, "perhaps you should rest. You've been writing for hours." "Rest?" Isabel didn't look up from her letter. "While my husband and his advisors dismantle everything I've worked to build." "I think not, Margaret. There's far too much work to be done." The first letter was addressed to her sister, Duchess Eleanor, who ruled a small but strategically important province in the northern mountains. Eleanor had always been the fiercer of the two sisters, the one who had chosen military strategy over marriage, who had built her duchy into a formidable force despite its size. If anyone could be counted on for support in the coming storm, it would be Eleanor. The second letter was to Count Marcus, her cousin, who controlled the kingdom's second-largest port city. Marcus had always been grateful for the preferential trade agreements Isabel had helped negotiate during her time as queen, and she was counting on that gratitude now. The third letter was perhaps the most important of all. It was addressed to Lady Catherine Whitmore, the head of the Ladies' Society, an organization of noble women that had grown increasingly powerful during Isabel's reign. What had started as a charitable organization had evolved into an informal network of influence that reached into every corner of Valdorian society. Catherine Whitmore commanded the loyalty of hundreds of noble families, and her support could make or break political careers. "Are you certain this is the right path?" Margaret asked as she watched Isabel seal the last letter with her personal signet ring. Open defiance could be seen as treason. Isabel finally looked up, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Treason? I've served this kingdom faithfully for 15 years. I've put its needs above my own desires countless times. If wanting to protect my dignity and my rights as a queen is treason, then perhaps this kingdom doesn't deserve my loyalty." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Margaret opened it to reveal a young page, his face flushed with excitement and nervousness. "Begging your pardon, Your Majesty," the boy stammered, "but Lord Pemberton has requested your presence in the Blue Salon. The Asturian ambassador has arrived, and there are developments." Isabel exchanged a glance with Margaret. Developments in diplomatic situations were rarely good news, especially when they involved hastily called meetings. "Tell Lord Pemberton I'll be along shortly," Isabel said, then added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "and tell him I'm looking forward to meeting our Asturian friends." After the page left, Margaret helped Isabel into her most formal day dress, a deep blue gown that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the color of her eyes. If this was to be one of her last official acts as queen, she intended to look every inch the part. The Blue Salon was one of the palace's most impressive reception rooms, with soaring ceilings painted with scenes from Valdorian history and windows that offered sweeping views of the capital city. When Isabel entered, she found a scene that was both familiar and utterly changed. King Alexander stood near the massive fireplace, his posture rigid with tension. Beside him, Lord Pemberton wore an expression of barely concealed triumph. Across from them, Ambassador Heinrich of Astoria sat in one of the room's elegant chairs, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his dark eyes sharp with intelligence. But it was the young woman sitting beside the ambassador who captured Isabel's attention. Princess Catherine of Astoria was indeed beautiful, with golden hair that caught the light and blue eyes that seemed almost luminous. She was perhaps 20 years old, with the kind of fresh-faced beauty that made Isabel acutely aware of her own 37 years. The princess wore a traveling dress of deep green silk that spoke of both wealth and taste, and her posture conveyed the confidence of someone born to power. "Ah, Your Majesty," Pemberton said as Isabel entered, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "How good of you to join us. I believe you know Ambassador Heinrich, and may I present Her Royal Highness, Princess Catherine of Astoria. The princess rose gracefully and offered a curtsy that was perfectly calculated, deep enough to show respect for a reigning queen, but not so deep as to suggest subservience. Isabel could see intelligence in those blue eyes, and something else that might have been sympathy. "Your Majesty," Princess Catherine said, her voice carrying a slight accent that made her words sound musical. "It's an honor to meet you. I've heard so much about your charitable works and your dedication to the people of Valdoria." "How kind," Isabel replied, matching the princess's formal tone. "I trust your journey was pleasant. It's quite a long way from Astoria." Indeed it was, but the prospect of strengthening the bonds between our kingdoms made any inconvenience worthwhile. The polite dance of diplomatic conversation continued for several minutes, but Isabel could feel the undercurrents of tension running through the room like electricity before a storm. Ambassador Heinrich watched every exchange with the calculating gaze of a man who made his living reading between lines and understanding unspoken messages. "Perhaps we should discuss the purpose of this meeting," Alexander finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "I understand there have been developments regarding the situation along our borders." Ambassador Heinrich leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Indeed, Your Majesty. I'm pleased to report that upon learning of the proposed marriage alliance between Princess Catherine and yourself, King Ferdinand has ordered the withdrawal of our border forces. The threat of military action has been averted." "How fortunate," Isabel said, her voice sweet, but with an edge that made Pemberton shift uncomfortably. "It's amazing how quickly diplomatic solutions can be found when the proper incentives are offered." Princess Catherine glanced between Isabel and Alexander, clearly sensing the tension but uncertain of its source. "I hope," she said carefully, "that our marriage will bring lasting peace and prosperity to both our kingdoms. It's a responsibility I don't take lightly." "Marriage?" Isabel asked, raising an eyebrow. "How presumptuous. I wasn't aware that any marriage had been agreed upon yet. After all, King Alexander is still very much married to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Ambassador Heinrich's face flushed red, while Pemberton looked as though he might have a seizure. Alexander's jaw clenched so tightly that Isabel could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. "Your Majesty," Pemberton said through gritted teeth, "perhaps this conversation would be better continued at a later time, when all parties have had opportunity to review the relevant documents." "Oh, I think this is the perfect time," Isabel said brightly. "After all, Princess Catherine should know exactly what she's walking into, shouldn't she? It would be terribly unfair to keep her in the dark about the complications." Princess Catherine's posture straightened, and Isabel could see steel beneath the young woman's beautiful exterior. "What complications?" she asked, her voice direct and uncompromising. Before anyone could stop her, Isabel began to speak. "Well, Your Highness, it seems that my dear husband has decided that our 15-year marriage is inconvenient to his political plans. He intends to have it annulled by the church so that he can marry you and secure your father's military protection. The fact that this requires him to perjure himself before God and break sacred vows apparently doesn't concern him overly much." "Isabel," Alexander's voice cracked like a whip, but she continued undaunted. "I thought you should know, Princess, that you're not just marrying a king. You're marrying a man who discards inconvenient wives when they no longer serve his purposes. I do hope you prove more useful than I did." The princess stared at Isabel for a long moment, her blue eyes unreadable. Then, she turned to Alexander, her expression expectant. "Is this true?" she asked quietly. "You're seeking an annulment of your current marriage?" Alexander looked as though he might strangle Pemberton, who had clearly failed to inform their Astorian guests about this particular detail. "The situation is complex," he said finally. "But, yes, the marriage will be dissolved before any new union takes place." Princess Catherine nodded slowly, then turned back to Isabel. "And you object to this arrangement?" "I object," Isabel said, "to being cast aside like a broken piece of furniture. I object to having my marriage declared invalid despite 15 years of faithful service to this kingdom. And I object to being replaced by someone young enough to be my daughter simply because my body failed to produce an heir." The raw pain in Isabel's voice seemed to affect the princess deeply. For a moment, her composed mask slipped, revealing something that might have been compassion. "I see," Catherine said quietly. Then, she stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "Ambassador Heinrich, I believe we need to return to our quarters and discuss this new information." There are considerations that must be addressed before any agreements can be finalized. Pemberton practically leaped to his feet. Your Highness, surely there's no need to delay. The paperwork is merely a formality. The important thing is the alliance between our kingdoms. Princess Catherine's gaze swept across the room, taking in each face with the assessing look of someone who had been trained in political maneuvering from childhood. Lord Pemberton, she said with quiet authority, in Astoria, we believe that the foundation of any alliance must be built on honor and truth. If King Alexander is willing to break sacred vows for political convenience, what guarantee do I have that he will honor any promises made to me or my kingdom? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander's face went white with shock and anger, while Pemberton looked as though he might faint. Your Highness, Alexander said carefully, I understand your concern, but the circumstances of my current marriage are unique. The Church has agreed that it was never valid in the eyes of God due to the lack of an heir. This isn't about convenience or politics. It's about rectifying a spiritual error. A spiritual error, Catherine repeated thoughtfully. How convenient that this spiritual error only became apparent when you needed a political alliance. Isabel found herself developing a grudging respect for the young princess. Whatever else Catherine might be, she was clearly no naive child to be manipulated by smooth words and political necessities. Perhaps, Catherine continued, we should postpone any formal discussions until this matter is resolved. I would hate for my father to enter into an alliance based on false premises. With that devastating diplomatic strike, Princess Catherine curtsied formally to the room and swept out, leaving Ambassador Heinrich scrambling to follow in her wake. The heavy doors closed behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Pemberton turned to Isabel with fury blazing in his eyes. You've ruined everything, he hissed. Do you have any idea what you've done? The Astorians could withdraw their offer entirely. We could be at war within the week. Then, perhaps, Isabel said calmly, you should have thought of that before you decided to treat me like a disposable inconvenience. You selfish, vindictive. That's enough, Alexander said sharply, his voice cutting through Pemberton's rage. Leave us, both of you. Pemberton looked as though he might argue, but one look at the king's face convinced him otherwise. He stalked from the room, muttering under his breath about women and their inconvenient emotions. When they were alone, Alexander turned to his wife with an expression that mixed hurt, anger, and something that might have been admiration. That was well played, he said quietly. You've managed to throw our entire diplomatic strategy into chaos with just a few words. Good, Isabel replied. If you want to destroy our marriage for political gain, you can at least work for it. This isn't a game, Isabel. People's lives are at stake. The kingdom's future hangs in the balance. My life is at stake too, she shot back. My future, my dignity, my very identity. But, apparently, that doesn't matter as long as the kingdom's needs are served. Alexander ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered from their early years together. What do you want from me? I can't change the political realities we're facing. I can't change the fact that we have no heir. I can't change the fact that this marriage alliance could save thousands of lives. I want, Isabel said, her voice steady and determined, to be treated with the respect I've earned through 15 years of service to this crown. I want acknowledgement that I've been a good queen and a faithful wife. And I want assurance that my future will be secure and dignified. You'll have an estate, a title, financial security. I want more than that. Isabel stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the determination in her green eyes. I want to remain involved in the kingdom's charitable works. I want to maintain my position with the Ladies' Society. I want to have a voice in the policies that affect the people I've spent 15 years serving. Alexander stared at her in amazement. You want to remain politically active? After the annulment. I want to remain useful, she corrected. I want my knowledge and experience to continue benefiting Valdoria, even if I'm no longer its queen. For a moment, something like the old understanding flickered between them. Alexander had always respected Isabel's intelligence and political acumen, had often sought her counsel on matters of state. The idea of completely losing that partnership was clearly painful for him as well. The Church would never allow it, he said finally. An annulled wife maintaining political influence? It would be unprecedented. Then, we'll have to make new precedents, Isabel said. Unless, of course, you prefer to continue dealing with Princess Catherine's very reasonable questions about your honor and trustworthiness. Alexander's laugh was bitter but held a note of genuine amusement. You really have thought this through, haven't you? I've had 3 days to think about nothing else. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of 22 years of shared history heavy between them. Despite everything that had happened, despite the hurt and betrayal, they had once loved each other deeply. That love had been tested by the demands of kingship, by the pressure to produce an heir, by the grinding weight of political necessity. But it had never been completely destroyed. I never wanted to hurt you, Alexander said quietly. You have to believe that. I know, Isabel replied, and was surprised to find that she meant it. But you did hurt me, and now we both have to live with the consequences. The door opened again, and Margaret appeared, her face carefully neutral. Your Majesty, she said to Isabel, you have visitors. Duchess Eleanor has arrived from the north, and Count Marcus is requesting an audience. Isabel felt a surge of satisfaction. Her letters had worked even faster than she had hoped. Her sister and cousin were here, which meant her support network was beginning to form. I'll see them in my private sitting room, she said, then turned back to Alexander. I believe you have some damage control to do with our Astrian guests. I suggest you think carefully about what you're willing to offer to regain their confidence. As she walked toward the door, Alexander called after her. Isabel. She paused but didn't turn around. This isn't over, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. But, as she left the blue salon to meet with her allies, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Princess Catherine had proven to be more formidable than anyone had expected. Alexander was clearly having second thoughts about his decision, and Pemberton would undoubtedly be working furiously to salvage his carefully laid plans. The game of royal politics was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated, and Isabel intended to make sure she held all the best cards. The private sitting room in the eastern wing of the palace had always been Isabel's sanctuary, a place where she could escape the formal constraints of royal life and speak freely with trusted friends and family. The walls were lined with books she had collected over the years, and comfortable chairs were arranged around a fireplace that cast warm light across the Persian rugs. It was here that she had planned charity galas, discussed kingdom business with her ladies-in-waiting, and now, where she would plan her political survival. Duchess Eleanor stood by the tall windows, her military bearing evident even in civilian dress. At 42, she was 5 years older than Isabel, with the same auburn hair, but sharper features that reflected her no-nonsense personality. She had ruled her northern duchy with an iron fist for over a decade, turning what had once been a struggling mountain province into a prosperous and well-defended territory. Eleanor had never married, claiming that she preferred commanding armies to managing husbands, and her success had made her one of the most respected leaders in the kingdom. Count Marcus sat in one of the armchairs, his merchant's eye taking in the details of the room's furnishings with professional interest. At 50, he was a self-made man who had inherited a modest port town and built it into the kingdom's second most important trading center. His success in business had earned him political influence, and his loyalty to Isabel stemmed from years of profitable cooperation on trade policies that had benefited both his city and the kingdom as a whole. Sister, Eleanor said as Isabel entered, her voice carrying both affection and concern. I came as soon as I received your letter. This business with Alexander is madness. Is it? Isabel asked, settling into her favorite chair. Or is it simply politics at its most ruthless? It's short-sighted, Marcus interjected, setting down his teacup with a sharp click against the saucer. Alexander may think he's solving his immediate problems, but he's creating far greater ones. The merchant class is already uneasy about the instability. Uncertainty is bad for business, and bad business means reduced tax revenues. Eleanor turned from the window, her expression grim. The military situation is even worse. My contacts in the army tell me that morale is suffering. The soldiers respected you, Isabel. They saw you as a stabilizing influence on Alexander's sometimes impulsive decisions. If he discards you so easily, they're wondering what other loyalties he might abandon when convenient. Isabel nodded, filing away this information. She had suspected that the annulment would have broader consequences than Alexander and Pemberton had considered, but hearing it confirmed by her allies was both validating and troubling. What about the church? She asked. Have you heard anything from Bishop Morrison? Marcus leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. That's where things get interesting. The bishop is deeply uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. He's received instructions from the archbishop to cooperate with the annulment, but my sources say he's been asking pointed questions about the theological justifications. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests he doesn't believe a 15-year marriage can be retroactively declared invalid simply because it failed to produce an heir, Eleanor said with satisfaction. Bishop Morrison may be a politician, but he's also a man of genuine faith. The idea of perjuring himself before God for political convenience doesn't sit well with him. Isabel felt a spark of hope. Bishop Morrison had performed her wedding ceremony to Alexander, had counseled them through difficult periods in their marriage, and had been a trusted advisor for years. If he was having doubts about the annulment, it could provide the opening she needed. There's something else, Marcus said, glancing at Eleanor before continuing. Lady Catherine Whitmore sent word that she's calling an emergency meeting of the Ladies' Society. She's disturbed by recent developments. The Ladies' Society meeting was scheduled for that very afternoon, and Isabel had been planning to attend despite the risk of appearing to organize political opposition. Catherine Whitmore commanded enormous influence among the noble families, and her support could make the difference between a quiet annulment and a kingdom-wide scandal. I need to know where everyone stands, Isabel said. Eleanor, what about the Northern Lords? Can I count on their support? Duke William is solidly behind you, Eleanor replied without hesitation. He's never liked Pemberton's influence over Alexander, and he sees this annulment as part of a larger pattern of poor decision-making. Lord Hertford is more cautious, but he's concerned about the precedent this sets. If marriages can be dissolved whenever they become politically inconvenient, what's to stop the same thing from happening to other noble families? Marcus nodded agreement. The same concerns are echoing through the merchant class. Contract law depends on the sanctity of agreements. If the king can simply ignore a marriage contract, what other agreements might he decide to abandon? The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Lady Margaret entered with a worried expression. Your Majesty, she said quietly, Princess Catherine has requested a private audience with you. She's waiting in the rose garden. Isabel exchanged glances with Eleanor and Marcus. This was unexpected and potentially very dangerous. Meeting privately with her husband's intended bride could be seen as manipulation or conspiracy, but it could also provide an opportunity to understand what the princess was really thinking. Tell her I'll be along shortly, Isabel said, then turned to her allies. Continue planning. I want to know exactly who we can count on and who might be wavering, and find out what Pemberton is doing to counter our efforts. The rose garden was one of the palace's most beautiful features, with carefully tended beds of flowers arranged around a central fountain. It was also relatively private, surrounded by high hedges that muffled sound and provided concealment from watching eyes. Princess Catherine stood beside the fountain, still wearing her green traveling dress, but with a light shawl against the afternoon breeze. Up close, Isabel could see that the princess was older than she had first appeared, probably 22 or 23 rather than 20. There were lines of intelligence around her blue eyes, and a set to her jaw that spoke of determination and perhaps stubbornness. This was not a naive girl to be easily manipulated. Your Majesty, Catherine said, offering a curtsy that was respectful but not subservient. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Your Highness, Isabel replied, matching the formal tone. I confess I'm curious about what you wish to discuss. Catherine gestured toward a stone bench beneath a flowering arbor, and they sat together with the careful distance of diplomatic negotiation. I want to understand, Catherine said without preamble, what really happened between you and King Alexander. The official version doesn't match what I observed in that room earlier. Isabel studied the younger woman's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw was genuine curiosity and what appeared to be honest concern. Why does it matter to you? Isabel asked. Surely your father's political objectives are more important than the personal feelings of people you've never met. Perhaps, Catherine acknowledged. But I've learned that political alliances built on dishonesty rarely last. If I'm going to marry King Alexander, I need to understand what kind of man he is. And if he's willing to discard a wife who has served faithfully for 15 years, I need to know what that means for my own future. The honesty of the statement caught Isabel off guard. She had expected manipulation, perhaps an attempt to convince her to withdraw gracefully. Instead, she was facing a young woman who seemed genuinely concerned about the moral implications of the marriage she was being asked to make. He wasn't always like this, Isabel said carefully. When we married, Alexander was different. Younger, more idealistic, more willing to make decisions based on personal convictions rather than political necessity. What changed him? Isabel considered the question thoughtfully. The crown changed him. Or perhaps it revealed aspects of his character that were always there, but hidden. The weight of responsibility, the constant pressure from advisors, the knowledge that every decision affects thousands of lives, it wears on a person. And Lord Pemberton? Pemberton has been whispering in his ear for years, convincing him that personal happiness must always be sacrificed for the good of the kingdom. The man has no understanding of the human cost of his political calculations. Catherine nodded slowly. In Astoria, we have a saying, a king who loses his humanity loses his right to rule. It sounds as though King Alexander may be in danger of forgetting that wisdom. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the splash of the fountain and the distant sounds of palace life continuing around them. Then, Catherine spoke again, her voice thoughtful. There's something you should know, she said. My father didn't send me here just to secure a marriage alliance. He's concerned about the stability of Valdoria's government. There have been reports of unrest in the eastern provinces, economic difficulties, and now this situation with your marriage. He's beginning to wonder if King Alexander is still capable of effective leadership. Isabel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon breeze. If King Ferdinand of Astoria was questioning Alexander's competence, it meant the political situation was even more precarious than she had realized. What kind of reports? She asked. Tax collections are down, trade has decreased, and there have been several incidents of civil unrest that were suppressed but not resolved. My father's advisors believe that King Alexander may be losing control of his kingdom. And if that proves to be true, Catherine's expression grew grim. Then, Astoria might decide that a military alliance isn't enough. We might need to consider more direct intervention to protect our interests. The implications hung in the air between them like a sword. If Astoria decided that Valdoria was no longer a reliable ally, they might choose to annex the kingdom rather than ally with it. Alexander's attempt to secure his borders through marriage could backfire spectacularly if he appeared too weak to be an effective partner. Why are you telling me this? Isabel asked. Because, Catherine said, I think you might be the key to preventing a disaster. You know this kingdom better than anyone. You understand its people, its problems, and its potential solutions. If there's a way to stabilize the situation without war or annexation, you're the one most likely to find it. Before Isabel could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Lord Pemberton emerged from behind the hedge, his face flushed with anger and exertion. Your Highness, he said to Catherine, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. I've been looking everywhere for you. It's highly inappropriate for you to meet privately with. He paused, clearly searching for a term that wouldn't be openly insulting. With the Queen, Catherine finished coolly. I wasn't aware that diplomatic courtesy had become inappropriate, Lord Pemberton. Pemberton's face grew redder. The Queen's position is complicated at the moment. It would be better if you avoided any appearance of political entanglement. Political entanglement? Catherine rose from the bench, her posture radiating offended dignity. Lord Pemberton, I am a princess of Astoria, not some provincial maiden who needs to be told how to conduct herself. I will speak with whom I choose, when I choose, and I don't require your permission or approval. The dressing down was delivered with such aristocratic authority that Pemberton actually took a step backward. Isabel found herself fighting to suppress a smile. Of course, Your Highness, Pemberton stammered. I meant no disrespect. I was simply concerned about appearances. Your concerns are noted, Catherine said dismissively. Now, if you'll excuse us, Queen Isabel and I were having a most enlightening conversation about Valdorian history and culture. Pemberton looked as though he might argue further, but one look at Catherine's expression convinced him otherwise. He bowed stiffly and retreated the way he had come, clearly planning to report this development to the king immediately. When he was gone, Catherine turned back to Isabel with a rueful smile. I'm afraid I may have made your situation more complicated. On the contrary, Isabel replied, I think you may have made it much more interesting. As they walked back toward the palace together, Isabel found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about the political situation. Princess Catherine was clearly not the naive pawn that Pemberton had assumed she would be. If anything, she seemed more concerned about the moral and practical implications of the marriage alliance than anyone else involved in the negotiations. The real question was whether Catherine's intelligence and independence would prove to be an asset or a liability in the complex game of royal politics that was about to unfold. One thing was certain. The young princess had already demonstrated that she wouldn't be easily manipulated by anyone, including the man she was supposed to marry. That afternoon's meeting of the Ladies' Society promised to be very interesting indeed. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate had been transformed into a meeting hall, with elegant chairs arranged in concentric circles around a central podium. Lady Catherine Whitmore, resplendent in burgundy silk, commanded attention from her position at the front of the room. At 65, she had the silver hair and dignified bearing of aristocratic authority, but her sharp gray eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the assembled ladies of Valdorian high society. Isabel had arrived precisely on time, knowing that every moment of this gathering would be scrutinized and discussed for weeks to come. She wore a gown of deep violet that complemented her coloring and conveyed both elegance and subtle defiance. Around her sat the wives and daughters of dukes, counts, ministers, and wealthy merchants, women who collectively controlled enormous social and economic influence throughout the kingdom. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew why they had been called together, but the official topic of discussion was listed as charitable initiatives for the coming season. It was a thin veneer of respectability over what was essentially a political gathering. "Ladies," Catherine Whitmore began, her voice carrying easily through the large room. "I'm sure you're all aware of the recent developments concerning our beloved royal family. While we are not, of course, involved in matters of state, we cannot ignore the impact these changes may have on the charitable and social institutions we have worked so hard to build." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. The Ladies' Society had been instrumental in establishing schools, hospitals, and welfare programs throughout Valdoria, often working closely with Queen Isabel on these initiatives. If she were removed from her position, it could jeopardize years of careful work. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the wife of a prominent minister, raised her hand. "Catherine, perhaps you could clarify the Society's position on these developments? Are we to understand that our partnership with the royal family will continue unchanged?" "That," Catherine Whitmore replied smoothly, "depends entirely on who represents the royal family in the future. Our loyalty has always been to the crown and to the people of Valdoria. We have no interest in supporting initiatives that contradict our principles or undermine the institutions we've built." The message was clear to everyone in the room. The Society would not automatically transfer its allegiance to Princess Catherine simply because she would be the new queen. They would judge her based on her actions and commitment to their causes. Duchess Anne of Westfield, an elderly woman whose family had been prominent for generations, spoke up from her seat near the front. "I must say, I find the timing of these changes rather sudden. One would hope that any new arrangements would be made with proper consideration for all parties involved." "Indeed," agreed Lady Patricia Sterling, whose husband controlled significant mining interests. "Stability has always been important for our charitable work. Sudden changes in leadership can disrupt years of careful planning." Isabel listened to the careful, diplomatic language, understanding the subtext perfectly. These women were expressing their disapproval of the annulment without openly defying the king. They were also serving notice that their support for any new queen would not be automatically granted. Lady Catherine Whitmore gestured toward Isabel. "Perhaps your Majesty would care to address the Society about your future plans?" This was the moment Isabel had been preparing for. She rose gracefully, aware that every woman in the room was studying her face for signs of weakness or desperation. "Thank you, Catherine," she said, her voice steady and clear. "First, I want to express my gratitude for the support this society has shown me over the past 15 years. Together, we have accomplished remarkable things. We've built schools that have educated thousands of children, hospitals that have saved countless lives, and programs that have lifted families out of poverty." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Whatever changes may come in my personal circumstances, I remain committed to these causes. I have requested that any future arrangements include provisions for my continued involvement in the charitable works we have built together. The people of Valdoria deserve consistency in the programs that serve them, regardless of palace politics." The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Women throughout the room nodded approvingly, and several began to applaud. The message was clear. They supported Isabel's continued involvement and would resist any attempt to exclude her from their work. Lady Whitmore smiled with satisfaction. "I think I speak for all of us when I say that the Society would welcome your continued participation, Your Majesty. Our work is too important to be disrupted by administrative changes." The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions of specific programs and their funding needs. But the real business had been accomplished in those first few minutes. The Ladies' Society had declared its position, They would support Isabel's continued role in Valdorian charitable work, and they would scrutinize any new queen very carefully before offering their cooperation. As the gathering broke up into smaller conversations, Isabel found herself surrounded by supportive friends and allies. Lady Thornfield approached with a determined expression. "Isabel," she said quietly, "you should know that my husband has been expressing concerns about recent decisions at court. He believes that some of the king's advisors may be leading him astray." "What kind of concerns?" Isabel asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "The kind that suggest a wise king might benefit from better counsel," Lady Thornfield replied meaningfully. "Perhaps the kind of counsel that comes from experience rather than ambition." Before Isabel could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Princess Catherine had arrived, accompanied by two Asturian ladies-in-waiting and, surprisingly, by Lady Margaret. The room fell silent as Catherine entered. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that emphasized her youth and beauty, but her expression was serious and respectful. She had clearly come prepared to face what might be a hostile audience. Lady Whitmore moved to greet her with perfect diplomatic courtesy. "Your Highness, what an unexpected pleasure. I hope you'll forgive our informal gathering. We're simply discussing charitable matters." "Actually," Catherine said with a slight smile, "that's precisely why I'm here. I was hoping to learn more about Valdoria's charitable institutions. In Astoria, I've been involved in similar work, and I'm eager to understand how I might contribute to your efforts." It was a masterful opening move, showing respect for the society's work while subtly indicating her own qualifications. Several of the ladies looked impressed despite themselves. Lady Whitmore gestured toward the center of the room. "Perhaps you'd care to tell us about your experiences in Astoria?" Catherine moved to the front of the room with confident grace. But Isabel noticed that she was careful not to position herself as though she were taking over the meeting. "In Astoria," Catherine began, "I've been particularly involved in educational initiatives for girls. We've found that when you educate young women, the benefits extend to entire families and communities. I understand that Queen Isabel has done similar work here in Valdoria." She turned to acknowledge Isabel directly, a gesture that surprised and pleased the assembled ladies. "I've heard wonderful things about the schools you've established, Your Majesty. I would be honored to learn from your experience." The statement was perfectly calculated. Catherine was showing respect for Isabel's accomplishments while positioning herself as a potential collaborator rather than a replacement. Several women who had been skeptical began to look more favorably on the young princess. Lady Thornfield asked a series of detailed questions about Asturian educational methods, and Catherine answered with intelligence and obvious passion for the subject. It became clear that her interest in charitable work was genuine, not merely a political pose. As the conversation continued, Isabel found herself reassessing the princess once again. Catherine was clearly trying to build bridges rather than burn them, seeking cooperation rather than demanding submission. It was sophisticated political maneuvering that suggested maturity beyond her years. But the real test came when Duchess and asked a pointed question. "Your Highness, how do you view the relationship between charitable work and royal duty? Some might argue that such activities are mere hobbies for royal ladies." Catherine's response was immediate and forceful. "Duchess, and I believe that royal privilege creates royal responsibility. When you have been given advantages that others lack, you have an obligation to use those advantages for the benefit of all people, not just the privileged few. Charitable work isn't a hobby, it's a moral imperative." The passion in her voice was unmistakable, and it clearly resonated with the assembled ladies. Even Isabel found herself nodding in agreement with the sentiment. Lady Whitmore exchanged glances with several other prominent members of the society, and Isabel could practically see the collective decision being made. Catherine had passed their initial test. "Your Highness," Lady Whitmore said formally, "the society would be pleased to discuss ways that you might contribute to our work. Perhaps we could arrange for you to visit some of our institutions." "I would be delighted," Catherine replied, then added, "I hope such visits might include opportunities to work alongside Queen Isabel. I believe there's much I could learn from her experience." The room erupted in pleased murmurs. Catherine had not only shown interest in their work, but had explicitly acknowledged Isabel's continued importance to it. It was a diplomatic triumph that impressed even Isabel herself. As the formal meeting concluded and conversations broke up into smaller groups, Catherine approached Isabel directly. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "might I have a word with you privately?" They withdrew to a small antechamber off the main ballroom, where Catherine's composed mask slipped slightly. I wanted to apologize, she said without preamble. I had no idea when I came to Valdoria about the true circumstances of your situation. If I had known that King Alexander was seeking an annulment without your consent, I would never have agreed to these negotiations. Isabel studied the younger woman's face, searching for signs of deception. What she saw was genuine distress, and what appeared to be honest regret. What will you do now? Isabel asked. Catherine sighed deeply. I don't know. My father expects this alliance to proceed, and the political situation between our kingdoms is genuinely precarious. But I can't in good conscience marry a man who would cast aside his wife so callously. Even if it means disappointing your father and potentially destabilizing the relationship between Astoria and Valdoria. Even then, Catherine said firmly, I've seen what happens when royal marriages are built on political convenience rather than mutual respect. They create instability rather than preventing it. Before Isabel could respond, urgent voices in the main ballroom caught their attention. They hurried back to find Lady Margaret in intense conversation with Lady Whitmore, her face pale with concern. What's happened? Isabel asked immediately. Lady Margaret turned to her with obvious distress. Your Majesty, there's been an incident at the palace. Bishop Morrison collapsed during a meeting with King Alexander and Lord Pemberton. He's been taken to his chambers, but the physicians are concerned about his condition. The news hit Isabel like a physical blow. Bishop Morrison was not just the kingdom's senior religious authority. He was a friend and trusted advisor. More importantly, he was the key to the annulment proceedings. If something happened to him, it could throw the entire political situation into chaos. Princess Catherine's face showed immediate concern. Is there anything I can do to help? The genuine worry in her voice confirmed what Isabel had been beginning to suspect. Despite the political circumstances that had brought her to Valdoria, Catherine was fundamentally a decent person who cared about the welfare of others. We should return to the palace immediately, Isabel said, already moving toward the door. If the bishop is seriously ill, there will be consequences far beyond his personal welfare. As they traveled back to the palace together, Isabel couldn't shake the feeling that Bishop Morrison's collapse was more than just a medical emergency. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too suspicious. If someone was willing to harm a man of God to advance their political agenda, then no one was safe. The game of royal politics had just taken a much darker and more dangerous turn. The palace corridors buzzed with whispered conversations and nervous energy as news of Bishop Morrison's collapse spread throughout the building. Servants hurried past with purposeful urgency, carrying messages and medical supplies, while courtiers gathered in small groups to discuss the implications of this unexpected crisis. The very air seemed charged with tension, as though everyone understood that this incident would have consequences far beyond one man's health. Isabel moved through the familiar halls with Princess Catherine beside her, both women's faces etched with concern. Lady Margaret had remained at the Whitmore estate to coordinate with the Ladies' Society, but not before promising to relay any important developments. The absence of her most trusted advisor made Isabel feel more vulnerable as she approached what she suspected would be a very delicate situation. They found Dr. Harrison emerging from the bishop's chambers, his face grave and his hands stained with ink from his medical notes. The elderly physician had served the royal family for over 30 years and was known for his discretion as much as his skill. His expression told them everything they needed to know before he spoke a single word. Your Majesty, he said with a respectful bow to Isabel, then acknowledged Catherine with equal courtesy. Your Highness, how is he, Doctor? Isabel asked immediately. Dr. Harrison glanced around the corridor, noting the servants and minor courtiers who had found reasons to linger nearby. Perhaps we might speak somewhere more private? They followed him to a small consultation room adjacent to the bishop's chambers. Once inside with the door firmly closed, the doctor's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing his deep concern. Bishop Morrison is alive, he began carefully, but his condition is serious. He collapsed during what I'm told was a rather heated discussion with His Majesty and Lord Pemberton. When I examined him, I found symptoms consistent with acute poisoning. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Princess Catherine gasped audibly, while Isabel felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Poisoning, Isabel repeated, hardly believing what she was hearing. Are you certain? The symptoms are unmistakable, Dr. Harrison replied grimly. Rapid pulse, difficulty breathing, severe abdominal distress, and a distinctive pallor. I've seen similar cases before, though never in the palace. What kind of poison? Catherine asked, her diplomatic training allowing her to ask the practical questions despite her shock. Based on the onset and symptoms, most likely something derived from foxglove. It's readily available in any garden, can be mixed into food or drink, and produces effects that can be mistaken for a heart episode if one isn't looking for signs of poisoning. Isabel's mind raced with the implications. Foxglove was indeed common in palace gardens, and the knowledge of its properties wasn't limited to physicians. More troubling was the timing. Bishop Morrison had been the key obstacle to the annulment proceedings, the one man whose conscience had been troubling him about the theological justifications for dissolving her marriage. Who had access to whatever the bishop consumed before the meeting? Catherine asked. Dr. Harrison's expression grew even more troubled. That's the disturbing part. According to the servants, Bishop Morrison had only consumed wine that was served from the same bottle used by His Majesty and Lord Pemberton. If it was indeed poisoned, it was done with remarkable precision to affect only one person. The sophistication required for such selective poisoning suggested someone with both medical knowledge and palace access. The list of people who fit both criteria was disturbingly short. Doctor, Isabel said carefully, I need to know, will Bishop Morrison recover? If my treatment is effective, and if no additional poison is administered, yes. But it will be several days before he's well enough to resume his duties, and weeks before he's fully recovered. Several days. Long enough for the annulment proceedings to be placed in the hands of someone more malleable, someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about the theological validity of dissolving a 15-year marriage. Has King Alexander been informed of your suspicions about poisoning? Catherine asked. Dr. Harrison hesitated. I felt it prudent to consult with your Majesty first, he said to Isabel, given the delicate nature of the current situation. Isabel understood immediately. Dr. Harrison suspected that someone close to the king might be responsible for the poisoning, and he was placing his loyalty to her above his formal obligations to the crown. It was both touching and terrifying. Thank you for your discretion, Doctor, she said formally. Please continue treating Bishop Morrison with all possible care. And please say nothing of your suspicions to anyone else until we've had time to consider the implications. After Dr. Harrison left, Isabel and Catherine sat in the small room, both struggling to process what they had learned. This changes everything, Catherine said quietly. If someone is willing to poison a bishop to advance political goals, then no one is safe. The question is who? Isabel replied, though she had her suspicions, and whether this was done with or without Alexander's knowledge. Before Catherine could respond, the door burst open and Lord Pemberton strode in without knocking. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his hair messed, and his face flushed with what appeared to be anger mixed with panic. Your Majesty, he said to Isabel, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, I must insist that you return to your chambers immediately. The situation with Bishop Morrison is delicate, and your presence here could be misinterpreted. Misinterpreted how? Catherine asked coolly, her aristocratic authority evident in every word. Pemberton seemed to notice the princess for the first time, and his expression grew even more agitated. Your Highness, this is a domestic matter that doesn't concern Astoria. On the contrary, Catherine replied with ice in her voice, the health and safety of Valdoria's religious leadership concerns me greatly. After all, if I'm to marry your king, I need to know that his advisors are capable of protecting important figures in the kingdom. The barb hit its mark. Pemberton's face went pale, and Isabel could see him calculating the political implications of Catherine's words. If the princess began questioning the competence of Valdoria's security arrangements, it could jeopardize the entire alliance. Of course, Your Highness, Pemberton said, attempting to regain his composure. But I'm sure you understand that medical matters require discretion. Medical matters, yes, Isabel interjected meaningfully. But this appears to be more than a simple medical matter, doesn't it, Lord Pemberton? The look that flashed across Pemberton's face told her everything she needed to know. He was aware that the bishop had been poisoned, which meant he was either responsible for it or he knew who was. I'm not sure what you're implying, Pemberton said carefully. I'm not implying anything, Isabel replied. I'm stating directly that Bishop Morrison was poisoned, and I'm wondering what you know about it. The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Pemberton's face cycled through several expressions: shock, anger, calculation, and, finally, something that might have been resignation. These are very serious accusations, he said finally. I hope you have evidence to support them. Dr. Harrison's medical opinion is evidence enough for me, Isabel replied. The question is what we do with that information. Before Pemberton could respond, King Alexander appeared in the doorway. He looked haggard and older than his 55 years, the stress of recent events clearly taking its toll. His eyes swept the room, taking in the tense tableau before him. What's going on here? He asked wearily. Your Majesty, Catherine said, rising gracefully. We were just discussing Bishop Morrison's condition with Lord Pemberton. I understand it's quite serious. Alexander nodded gravely. Dr. Harrison says it may be several weeks before he can resume his duties. In the meantime, we'll need to make alternative arrangements for the annulment proceedings. How convenient, Isabel said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Alexander's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with anger. What is that supposed to mean? It means, Isabel said, standing to face him directly, that the one man who was expressing doubts about the theological validity of our annulment has been conveniently removed from the proceedings. Are you suggesting? Alexander began, his voice rising. I'm suggesting that the timing is remarkably fortunate for those who want to rush through an annulment without inconvenient questions being asked. The tension in the room was now palpable. Catherine watched the exchange with sharp intelligence, clearly filing away every word for future consideration. Pemberton looked as though he might be planning an escape route. Enough, Alexander said sharply. I won't have you spreading conspiracy theories about a man's illness. Illness? Isabel's voice grew cold. Is that what you're calling it? Because Dr. Harrison has a different opinion about what caused Bishop Morrison's collapse. Alexander's face went white. What are you talking about? For the first time since the crisis began, Isabel saw genuine shock and confusion in her husband's eyes. Either he was a better actor than she had ever realized, or he truly had no knowledge of the poisoning. Alexander, she said more gently, Bishop Morrison was poisoned. Dr. Harrison confirmed it. Someone gave him foxglove, probably in his wine. The king staggered as though he had been struck. He looked around the room wildly, his gaze finally settling on Pemberton. Is this true? He demanded. Pemberton's carefully composed mask finally cracked completely. Your Majesty, I can explain, you knew? Alexander's voice was barely controlled fury. You knew that someone had poisoned Bishop Morrison, and you said nothing? The situation required immediate action, Pemberton said desperately. The bishop was wavering, asking questions that could have undermined the entire annulment. Without the annulment, the Asturian alliance falls apart, and we face war within the month. I did what was necessary to protect the kingdom. You did what was necessary? Alexander repeated incredulously. You poisoned a man of God to advance your political agenda? I protected the crown. Pemberton shot back. Someone had to make the hard decisions while you struggled with sentiment and conscience. The kingdom's survival is more important than one man's life. The admission hung in the air like a confession of guilt. Princess Catherine stared at Pemberton with undisguised revulsion, while Alexander looked as though his entire world was crumbling around him. Get out, Alexander said quietly. Your Majesty, get out. The king's voice thundered through the small room. Get out of my sight before I have you arrested for attempted murder. Pemberton fled, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more oppressive than his presence had been. Alexander collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, while Catherine and Isabel watched him with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice muffled by his hands. I swear to you both, I had no knowledge of this. I thought he had simply fallen ill from the stress of the situation. I believe you, Isabel said softly, and was surprised to find that she meant it. Catherine moved closer,